Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you here today. It's a great pleasure. And it's also a great pleasure to welcome on the stage with me Peter Gordon to my right and Rahel Jaeggi to my left, who are here today to discuss the role of negativity and happiness in critical theory. If one knows any central propositions by Adorno at all, the following two are likely the top candidates. There is no right living in the wrong world, or es gibt kein richtiges Leben im Falschen, and the whole is the untrue, das Ganze ist das Unwahre, both from Minima Moralia. These famous sentences have suggested to most readers that we should understand or have to understand Adorno as a radical negativist. He seems to suggest that we live in a fundamentally misguided time in which really every aspect of our life is tainted and affected by the falsity of the total social framework or the totality of social relations. The falsity of our form of life thus seems to be so pervasive that we can't assume to find any islands in which we can preserve some right living, or any retreats that would give us a firm handle on the norms that define what right living would be. Understood in this way, we are subject to a double leg, I would say, an ontological one and an epistemological one. There are no instances of truly succeeding and fulfilling acts of human life. And on the one hand, and on the other, we don't even have access to an understanding of what they theoretically would have to look like. We wouldn't even know if they were around. Yeah. So if that were true, then we would not only be in an incredibly bleak situation. That would be the first thing to note. It would be very dark today, but also it would seem quite mysterious how we could even know with any confidence, and Adorno seems to be quite confident about his diagnosis, that this is the case. By virtue of what capacity or experience are we at all able to criticize the world? And with the help of what capacity or experience can we guide our critical diagnosis to move into the right direction? In his new book, Prekäres Glück, Adorno und die Quellen der Normativität, which you see here, Peter Gordon does not only show that these challenges that I've just rehearsed are pertinent and forceful, he suggests that there is actually a different way of reading Adorno that gets us out of this conundrum. And without diminishing, I think I should add, the radicality of Adorno's critique. Rather than being a complete negativist, Adorno thinks we actually do have access to positive sources of normativity in our current life form. Adorno is, to be more precise, oriented by experiences of what Peter Gordon calls precarious happiness that give us a normative basis for our critique and serve as an anticipation of a better, more humane condition of the world. We are here today to hear some more about this alternative reading of Adorno and to discuss how it relates to the challenges of critical theory today. To that end, Peter will first give us a brief introduction to his book before Rahel Jaeggi will then contribute some critical questions and comments that will get us into a conversation that we then will continue for a while. And then after about an hour or so, I will also give you the chance to chime in and add further observations. The three big issues that we want to focus on are the following. First, in what sense is Adorno's account negative? What are the merits and the problems of his negativity? How exactly do we have to understand it? Secondly, what is his notion of happiness more precisely, and why is happiness the best normative notion to organize critical theory today? And not, for example, freedom or reason. And finally, what can we learn from Adorno about the questions of critical theory today, and how are contemporary challenges of critical theory relevant to maybe shift the framework that we find in Adorno? So these are the three main issues or big complexes that we want to touch upon in the discussion. So because you're here, I'm quite certain that you know Peter Gordon or know who he is and know who Rahel Jaeggi is. So let me skip their CVs and just stick to the bare minimum of information. Peter Gordon is the Amabel B. James Professor of History at Harvard University and a member of the Department of Philosophy there as well. His most recent book is the one we will be discussing tonight, Precarious Glück. Rahel Jaeggi is professor of philosophy at the HU Berlin and co-director of the Center for Social Critique. Her most recent book, which was discussed just a few months ago in this beautiful room, has the title Fortschritt und Regression. My name is Thomas Khurana. I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Potsdam and director of the Center for Post-Kantian Philosophy. I think that's all I need to say. I'm very excited about tonight's discussion and the opportunity to discuss this wonderful book with Peter and with Rael tonight. And so I think we can just start and hear Peter Gordon on what brought him to write this book, this wonderful new book, and what, from his point of view, are the main ideas that we should be discussing tonight.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Thomas and Rahel, for joining me. Before I begin, I just also want to thank all of you for coming. I should also mention two other people who were quite important to me in writing this book. The first is Axel Honneth, who invited me to give the 2019 Adorno Vorlesungen, which formed the basic architecture for the arguments that's presented in the book. And also, I want to thank Eva Gilmer, who I don't think is here tonight, but she's my editor at Zurkamp, and she's been wonderful support along the way. If I could just begin with a few biographical details, this book represents, I would say, the culmination of a long turn of my interests. I really began as a Heidegger scholar and spent the first 10, 15 years of my life working away in the Schwarzwald. And the turn to Adorno was, in a way, a kind of Heimkehr toward a philosopher toward whom I felt greater personal and political affinities. My approach to Heidegger had always been a critical one, and turning to Adorno, I found a kindred spirit articulating some of the criticisms that I had only intuited and that were expressed by Adorno far better than I ever could. That said, in reading Adorno and then reading some of the interpretive literature on Adorno, I was seized by a certain frustration. And Professor Khurana has already introduced in some ways the core problematic that frustrated me. But I'll just begin by telling you, and many of you, of course, will know this, that in Frankfurt's West End, not far from the Institut für Sozialforschung, there's the apartment building where Theodor Adorno and Gretchen spent the last 20 years of their life. And affixed to the building is a plaque, which I believe is bronze. And the plaque shows Adorno's face. And of course, it says, Es gibt kein richtiges Leben im Falschen. Now, it seems to me that that image of Adorno has become reified, and I would say paradoxically, ironically, in the last revenge of the culture industry, it's become what you might call the commodified image of Adorno, which was reproduced on countless t-shirts, tote bags, and coffee cups the world over. It presents Adorno as what I would call a totalizing negativist. And according to this interpretation, using some of Adorno's own words, we should now see our society as a Verblendungszusammenhang, that is, a context of thoroughgoing delusion. Well, the argument of my book is that thesis of totalizing negativism is not entirely wrong, but it's misleading for at least two interlocking reasons. First, it fails the challenge of self-reflexivity. Any social theory that claims to be comprehensive, that is, that claims to offer a complete picture of our current social reality and how that social reality works, must respond to the question as to how the theory itself could be possible in the world it describes. In other words, it must explain the conditions of its own possibility. This is especially the case with critical theory, which claims to be dialectically entangled with the object of criticism. Now, the second reason closely follows upon that. Critique has no, as Adorno puts it, Archimedes point or transcendent point, place where it can stand. which is to say, critical theory must be an immanent critique of social reality. And this means that it must take advantage of normative resources that belong to that very same social reality. Now, the first point was once made by Jürgen Habermas, who believed that Adorno and Horkheimer failed the challenge of self-reflexivity. Habermas famously called this the problem of performative contradiction. And they said, and according to Habermas, Adorno and Horkheimer could make this charge only because they believed there was no way out, which is to say, this context of total delusion is one without exits. It's a huis clos. Now, the second point is that critique must be immanent. Now, I want to claim that in this respect, Adorno does follow, in certain respects, the neo-Marxist tradition and even Marx himself. Marx himself, I would say, practiced a form of immanent critique. Now, this is somewhat controversial, but I'll just ask you to recall Marx's inaugural address to the First International Workingmen's Association in 1864, when Marx spoke favorably of the 10 Hours Bill, which was, of course, passed by English Parliament. Now, had Marx been you might say, a totalizing negativist, he would have had no words of praise for the 10 Hours Bill, but in fact, he did. And he called the 10 Hours Bill the victory of a proletarian principle, which is to say, according to Marx, a properly materialist and dialectical understanding of history has to presuppose that the transformation of social reality emerges from immanent contradictions of society itself, and one can point to emergent norms and emergent social practices that are disharmonious with the dominant norms, say the dominant norms that merely affirm bourgeois society. Now, if I'm right that Adorno follows Marx in that respect, then the interpretation of thoroughgoing negativism simply can't be accurate. We can appreciate why it's misleading a little more if we look closely at Adorno's introductory lectures to sociology, which of course he gave in Frankfurt after his return from the United States. And what's interesting in those lectures is that Adorno takes issue with uh, two prominent figures in the tradition of sociology. The first figure is Talcott Parsons, the systems theorist famous in the United States as really promoting, introducing, popularizing Max Weber's sociology. And Adorno criticizes Parsonian sociology as harmonistic because it presents an image of society as if it is a working whole, a whole without contradictions or parts that don't conflict. According to Adorno, Parsons presents society as wholly true and harmonistic without breaks or contradictions. Now, that one we can understand why Adorno would reject. What's interesting is that Adorno goes on and mentions a second great figure in the history of sociology, Vilfredo Pareto. And according to Adorno, Pareto sees society as governed by a comprehensive but false ideology. And Adorno says that Pareto's view is no more plausible than the view of Talcott Parsons, because a theory of a comprehensively false ideology makes it impossible for us to distinguish between the true and the false. And we therefore end up in that same place where Adorno would, if Adorno subscribed to such a view, he would fail the challenge of self-reflexivity. So it seems to me we're therefore forced to adopt the view that Adorno himself stated on numerous occasions. The social whole is not seamless, not harmonious, neither seamlessly true nor seamlessly false. Instead, as he famously says, for example, zum Ende, at the end of Minima Moralia, it is shot through with Risse und Schwünde, that is, fractures and moments of internal contradiction, or Brüche, breaks. Now, granted, these moments are not powerful. And here's an important qualification that I only mention very quickly in passing in the book. Those breaks, those moments of contradiction, are subordinate to the hegemonic ideologies and social practices of our current bourgeois world. But the fact that they are subordinate should not deter us from acknowledging their presence. In fact, those subordinate moments, moments of contradiction, however weak, however dispersed they might be, are crucial to Adorno's critical work. Let me explain why. The moments of contradiction, as I read Adorno, have an anticipatory character. They exhibit what Axel Honneth calls a normative surplus, in the sense that they don't merely affirm social reality as it is, they point beyond the context of delusion toward the promise of its transformation, which is to say, quoting Jürgen Habermas's phrase, they have the character of imminent transcendence. We find them within our present social reality, but they also contain within themselves signs pointing to the self-transcendence of that social reality. Now, to drive home this point, let me recall Hegel from his Rechtsphilosophie, where, as you'll recall in the preface, he says that philosophy arrives too late to impose anything like a vigorous ought upon the world as it is. Prescription and description coincide, and the result is that philosophy has the task only of painting the gray of the world in gray, grau ins grau. Now, in negative dialectics, Adorno offers a rejoinder to Hegel without naming Hegel specifically. And he says, I'll quote it in English, consciousness could not despair over what is gray if it did not harbor the concept of a different color, whose scattered trace is not lacking in the negative whole. Now, to me, this is a very instructive rejoinder to Hegel, and this idea of scattered traces of a different color illustrates to us in lovely metaphors of light what Adorno's actual conception of a critique must be. From what I've said so far, 4 implications follow. If there are such scattered traces, that claim itself already rules out the thesis of total negativism. We need to qualify that thesis, adopting a view that has been called by others partial negativism, which, or to use a more common phrase in the history of German idealism, a version of dialectics. The thesis of partial negativism allows for the possibility that we can identify moments of normativity, moments of promise that resist or otherwise contest dominant norms of our current social world. Now, these traces may indeed be minimal, hence the title of Adorno's rejoinder to the apocryphal Aristotelian book Maxima Moralia, which he called Minima Moralia. The traces may be minimal, but if Adorno is to claim that critique is possible at all, those traces cannot be wholly absent. Third, these moments or traces should not, cannot be merely conceptual. And here Adorno's imagistic phrase, whose negative, a concept of a different color is somewhat misleading. Instead, we should be able to point to sensuous or materialist instances of the good in the midst of the bad. These serve as experiential warrants or phenomenological models for our appeal to what Adorno calls undistorted humanity. Now, these traces may indeed be rare, and according to Adorno, they are rare, and they are even on the verge of disappearing. So in that sense, they are minimal. But I want to insist, and this is maybe one of the more provocative ways of phrasing it, that they are charged with a maximal meaning, which is to say that they imply a dramatic transformation in all domains of our life. Now, finally, what are these experiential warrants or phenomenological models like? Well, Adorno furnishes ample instances for such experience throughout his writing. And I think if we just simply read what he has to say, they show up quite often. And we'll be quite familiar with a great many of them. Think of his remarks on children's games in Kaufmannsladen, the lovely little passage in Moralia, where he describes children's games as rehearsals or practices of the right life. Think further of Adorno's remarks on the practice of exchanging gifts. This is presumably not a practice that is reserved for the enchanted world of childhood. So in this case, we wouldn't want to accuse Adorno of mere nostalgia. He somehow thinks that the practice of exchanging gifts bears witness to our mimetic responsiveness to others and to the organic warmth that belongs to all living beings. Third, consider the enigmatic category of metaphysical experience from negative dialectics, one which Adorno says is indeed an instance of partial, qualified happiness. And finally, think of the normative promise of happiness in works of art. When Adorno says that works of art offer a promesse du bonheur, he means this, I think, quite seriously. And he means that works of art are not merely transcripts of social suffering. They are also promises of a happiness that the world does not fully satisfy. Now, a final note in this regard. All of these instances exemplify what Adorno finds most instructive, I would suggest, in Kant's doctrine of the postulates. The postulates of practical reason, you'll recall, orient us toward a counterfactual condition of satisfaction, the summum bonum, or highest good. Now, just as in Kant's critique of practical reason, the postulates provide the necessary orientation for practice, so too in Adorno's practice of critique, something like the postulate of happiness serves as the presupposition for Adorno's claim that the world is failing to measure up to what it should be. Adorno, in other words, could not claim that the world is objectionable at all if he did not presuppose some standard, however partial our understanding of this standard, as to how the world should be. Adorno admits, perhaps far more than Kant, that this postulate of happiness or human flourishing is fallibilistic and uncertain. I would argue that our standards by which we judge the world are as damaged as the world itself. But I would nonetheless insist, following Adorno, that despair itself is an affect with an implicit rationality. In other words, our affective response to the world is one of despair because it has drastically failed to be what it ought to be. Only this can explain why Kant believed that Kant's very doctrine of immortality could serve some instructive purposes for his own critical theory. And I'll end by pointing out that similar themes and appeals to happiness or appeals to some kind of fulfilled life run through all of Adorno's work and show up, not surprisingly, with some of their most vivid formulations in his aesthetic theory and particularly in his interpretations of music. In a lecture he gave at Darmstadt in the post-war era, he contested the view that the new music was merely a transcript of social suffering or a portrait of the world in its catastrophe. He rejected that view. And he famously said something which served as the title of my book: in the new music, there is as much precarious happiness as despair. And that's about as good as I can make the argument in this short period of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for this wonderful summary of the book and reminding us of the movements it goes through. And now I just want to give Rael the first word, of, making some comments of what we just heard and questions and so on.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to discuss this really wonderful book. I mean, I've heard some of the lectures and I've seen some of the manuscript, but it has, I mean, it is so incredibly rich. I mean, with the material that you go through, and of course, the overall thesis. So I'm actually a boring conversation partner here because I agree with so much of what Peter says, and I'll try to at least bring up some questions. I'll try to rub it in order to maybe clarify some of the issues at stake. So I agree. I totally agree with. So yeah, let me start with the boring stuff. I totally agree with your claim that Adorno is not a totalizing negativist, and that he actually does not have what our common friend Axel Honneth thinks he has, this kind of totalizing image of society that wouldn't allow for any cracks, any contradictions, any way out, or even glimpses of happiness here. I think you're right that he has. I mean, for some reasons that are, I mean, deep. Have to do with the way he does social theory, and but also for for different reasons. So he does see not only the social world as something that has cracks that allows for glimpses of happiness, also the kind of identity, as much as he is critical about subjectivity in terms of being mediated by society. But even here, I would say that, and here minima moralia, and actually, I mean, the material that you choose to engage with, namely, or also engage with, namely his works on music, are especially rich in this respect. So no no doubt that Adorno has to be understood in terms of having this much more subtle view on society, as well as on the subjects who, I mean, are partly a result, but also have some kind of Widerstandspotenzial, some resistance that, as he also says in Minima Moralia, stems from sometimes absolutely contingent ways in which subjects just don't fit, and from this very position, which is also has some autobiographical sense, of course, for Adorno, this misfit, the idea that there's we don't actually belong, even if society, I mean, goes all the way through. So I do think this is true. I'm not so sure whether the normative problem of critical theory can be solved by this, or whether it is even related the way that you seem to think it is related. I also agree that what he does is some kind of immanent critique, and that the result is not the kind of weak ethics that, for example, Fabian Freudenhagen, when he says, so in the end, Adorno's ethics is about living less wrongly, and I mean, you criticize this as too weak a position and too weak in ethics. And again, I totally agree. I think living less wrongly and this kind of what I would call liberal negativism, or the negativism of fear, where you can't actually say a lot about what the emancipated society or free society or happiness would be like, but just liberalism of fear that talks about suffering the way that, as I said, I mean, doesn't allow for a richer picture. I totally agree that Adorno wants more and has more to offer, but again, I'm not so sure it's exactly what you have in mind when you talk about those moments of happiness. So let me start with where I think the disagreement is. I do think that Adorno can be an immanent critique while staying a negativist. So I wouldn't say that the negativity of his approach is in any way, I mean, less radical, just because he also allows for those moments of precarious happiness. And this has something to do with a distinction that I would suggest we should make, namely the question of whether of empirical negativism and methodological negativism. It is a difference whether we ask ourselves whether the world is a good place or not, or whether it even allows for um, tiny little moments, cracks in which it is also a good place, or that allow for precarious happiness. But this is a different question from, I mean, whether Adorno would answer this, I mean, affirmatively or not. I would say has not so much to do with his methodological stance as a negativist. So even if the world would be a totally, I mean, even if he would not find those moments of precarious happiness, he could still remain an immanent critique and a strongly negativist immanent critique of society. This has, I think, something to do with the way we understand immanent critique, and there might be a difference between the both of us, how we understand immanent critique. You seem to suggest that immanent critique only works if we find something positive in our social world, in the reality. If we find some resources that are good already and can then serve as a standard for this critique. I would say that there are two different versions of immanent critique, or of the kind of lefty Galilean immanent critique that is at stake here. One of the versions would actually be the kind of, so there's already something, there is reason in the world, and there's something positive in the world. The other version would be negativist, namely, there are contradictions in the world, there is unreason in the world. And still, even if there would not be, I mean, even if it's all about contradiction and unreason, the immanent critique would be able to analyze the dynamics that or at least to analyze it such that standards for critique would be available for us. So this is then all about the contradictions, and I think you have a weaker concept of contradiction, maybe. So for you, contradiction is like a conflict of values within society, or values that are, or norms that are already there but are not fully realized, and have this kind of normative Überschuss that then could lead us out of this very situation. I would say that contradiction also for Adorno is a stronger notion, is something that points to a systematic, and also to something that for systemic reason cannot be without contradiction. And by that, it is the dynamics, I mean, the overcoming of those contradiction is what will lead us out in terms of this kind of immanent critique. So the only thing you don't need a positive moment in reality. I mean, in some way you do, but you need the crisis. You need the evidence that there is some kind of crisis, some kind of contradiction that reality cannot overcome without being transformed. And this is what then makes for them, the motivation for transformation, but also leads some kind of path towards this transformation. And as much as I think that Adorno is not the kind of dogmatic, immanent critique that, let's say, some left-Hegelians and a left-Hegelian as Marx would be. So for Adorno, the idea that this positive notion of contradiction as something that is actually the dynamic of social change is blurred and is a bit more, broken and not as stable, is precarious as well. But I would say this is another kind of precariousness than the precarious happiness that would, serve as a normative basis in your understanding. So I think we should maybe talk about the kind of negativism and the kind of immanent critique that is at stake here. And then my last point is, and this is also already about one of the topics that Thomas suggested to talk about, I'm not so sure that happiness is the one and only and the best way to describe it. Or at least, let's say, I always find it so interesting the way that Adorno, but also Horkheimer earlier on, the way they talk about happiness and freedom and reason and rationality. Sometimes there is not an easy way to distinguish between all of those. And I think one should take this serious. It's not just a lapse. It's not just that they were not so clear or somehow undecided whether it is about happiness or freedom or rationality and reason. I do think that there is an interesting idea of freedom, but also an interesting idea of happiness at stake here. And the idea that there is a strong connection that somehow freedom and happiness belong together. And then this would even lead to a situation where reason and another thing that plays such an important role. Adorno keeps on getting back to the idea of a reasonable society. And this is something we should take serious. And that is not actually the same as a society that makes us happy. So probably we should talk about how to get a bit deeper into those, the way that happiness, reason, and freedom is intertwined.
Yeah, many thanks. Peter, do you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rahel. Let me, let's see, I think I'll take these up in reverse order just because the last question is foremost in my mind at the moment. And this question of happiness is, of course, a very good one. One thing I do try to say right at the beginning of the book is that the term happiness is indeed too vague for what Adorno seems to have in mind. It's true that whatever that norm is of a fulfilled life seems to travel across a broad semantic range. Occasionally, he uses terms like unverstellte Menschheit. Sometimes, though less often, he'll speak about utopie. Yes, sometimes he'll speak about a rational society. What I would say is that, in a way, I would agree with you that all of these, in a sense, converge upon something that he presents in his introduction to dialectics, with reference to Hegel, but not only Hegel, which he calls the emphatic concept of a human being. And when Adorno uses this word, emphatisch, which he uses quite frequently, he uses it as the name for a standard that no empirical instance yet satisfies. That is, it serves precisely the kind of normative function that he needs in order to impose a critical demand on the world, that it live up to its promise. And the the emphatic concept of the human being, to me, helps us see how, for Adorno, something like happiness, or I would say in an Aristotelian sense, human flourishing, involves for Adorno rationality and freedom. In this respect, I do think he's very much a thinker in the left Hegelian tradition who subscribes to really a Greek notion of eudaimonia, right? I mean, which is a kind of well-being, but it's a well-being that he thinks the world presently disallows, or it allows only momentary glimpses of it. He thinks that there are particular occasions on which we gain some sense of what it is like. And I think those clues, those signs, those phenomenological models are crucial for him. And I think thinking of them as fulfilling the emphatic concept of the human being, or a concept of human flourishing, is a good way of organizing all these concepts. Now, of course, I think one could do it in other respects. For me, why I liked the term happiness is that it has such a strongly materialist and even sensuous character. And therefore, it helps us capture the importance of aesthetic experience for Adorno, but not just aesthetic experience, also what he calls metaphysische Erfahrung, which he thinks is a kind of happiness and has a sensuous character. It's like Adorno says, for a child, it's like a rainbow that you pursue. Once again, metaphors of light turn out to be very important for him. So so eudaimonia might be a better way of putting this, and this permits us to bring together happiness and freedom with some conception of some broad conception of rationality. The final point I'll make on this score is that despite the relentless negativism of a book like Dialektik der Aufklärung, sometime later in his lectures, he warned off his students from misunderstanding the point of the book. And he said, actually, let's not be mistaken. The problem isn't the Enlightenment. The problem is that the world isn't enlightened enough. Right. So he says the problem is partial or half enlightened, a half enlightened condition. And he once again invokes this as a standard, and he calls it emphatische Aufklärung. So.
May I just one point on this? So I think what you did was very interesting in the following sense. So the way I phrased the question about the happiness, it seemed to me that we could suggest we could roughly say we have three alternatives. So we could think we center our normative analysis or the critique on one normative core issue, and then Habermas would be the person who organizes everything around reason. And then the next generation of critical theory would organize everything around freedom. Think Honneth, think Menck in a certain sense, right? But then Adorno would be the forgotten candidate and happiness would be the notion. But then now the way you are now portraying it is no happiness, the way you understand it, is the more inclusive notion, so that we could say that those following generations of critical theory rather highlighted partial aspects of it. So only the reason aspect or only the freedom aspect, whereas the kind of happiness that you want to bring in view is, as you also suggested, so intertwined with freedom and reason that it's not, it doesn't make any sense to, as I did in my question, oppose these three candidates, but rather happiness aims to be the more inclusive notion in a certain sense.
I love that recommendation, and I would say that this is perhaps a better way of understanding the famous phrase. Es gibt kein richtiges Leben im Falschen is meant to warn us off from any belief in, say, an individualist conception of a perfectly fulfilled life in the midst of a bad social whole. And I think that that's really what Adorno had in mind. But sorry, I think I interrupted.
Again, I agree. Just about the happiness and eudaimonia. I mean, the problem is that there are also tensions. You can, I mean, even with a broad concept of happiness and a concept of happiness that is not just hedonistic and so on, and that I don't like the word flourishing so much, but I mean, I know what you mean, and of course it covers a lot. But there are also tensions. Couldn't it be that you flourish without being free, or at least this is something that people would try to play out against each other sometimes, happiness and freedom. And I do think that it's important to understand the thesis about happiness here, that happiness without freedom is not, in a certain way, not happiness, and the other way around, that freedom leads to a certain kind of happiness, not the kind of, I mean, totally childish idea of happiness, but something that has a lot to do with another word that is important, emancipation here, about, and also has a sensuous character. I mean, about somehow behaving in a free and fulfilled way towards the others and towards ourselves and so on. But here, I would say it's even a psychoanalytical connection between freedom, happiness, and rationality at stake here. That only, which also then means that rationality here has a much broader and, let's say, friendlier notion than you might think when you think of rationality as something that puts all these strong burdens on you. So again, I would say it's not so easy to just have it as a as the concept that would cover all of it. The inattentions have to be addressed here. And back to dialectic of enlightenment, I would totally agree. Of course, this is not such a. Always found it somehow weird that Habermas talks about it as, I mean, the darkest book, and that everyone would focus on the utterly pessimistic side here. I mean, talking about the normative foundations, this is a book about autonomy. I mean, about autonomy going wrong, and it's not so um, um, so difficult to detect what kind of normative standard there is. And I mean, you find it all over the book, I would say.
If I could, I completely agree with what you said. I have two small points. One is, um, I'm assuming everybody knows the lecture on Kultur und Culture, or maybe I have it backward, culture und Kultur. It, I was struck by the fact that Adorno gave this lecture 18 times. So he really loved it. And it's an interesting lecture um, uh, because of how strongly he emphasizes the idea of Erfüllung, of fulfillment. He speaks of it in two contexts in the lecture, and you'll recall that one of them is the rather perverse example of an American child eating an ice cream cone. And he says this is ein Stück erfüllte Utopie, right? I mean, what an extraordinary thing for Adorno to say about an American child eating an ice cream cone. Okay, so um, uh, the second example that he gives there is Romeo and Juliet, and there too he thinks that the experience of fulfillment and love is a model for us that we need to hold on to. And I'm struck by the fact that both of these have such a worldly and sensual character. Yes, I fully agree with you that rationality is at the core of Adorno's commitments, but there's some expansive conception of rationality at work for Adorno, such that our responsiveness to the non-identical, our mimetic response to the object, is for Adorno an illustration of undistorted reason, as against the kind of instrumental reason which has taken over our lives. So that,
This is also where you're right to put so much emphasis on unrestricted experience.
yeah,
Because this is part of what an unrestricted and expanded rationality would be like.
yeah, yeah. I guess that's all I want to say.
Yeah, so I thought that's very true of the book, that happiness is such an interesting category for you because it's an experiential category, and for the type of normative, for the kind of normative source that you're looking for, it seems that it makes a lot of sense to suggest that sometimes this was something that you also alluded to, that it seems like Adorno's critique might lack criteria or principles. So it's not that he has a form normative principle, but he starts from articulate an experiential scene, and within that experience, he finds some positive core, some normative some normative thing. So that I think that this is a very interesting aspect of your analysis that you, I mean, the book has in the subtitle, Adorno, the sources of normativity. The source of normativity doesn't seem to be an idea or a principle, but rather something that's contained in a certain kind of experience. And that's why these models are also so important for the book, I think.
Yeah, let me add in that respect that if there's one place in the book where I think I really begin to worry about Adorno's argument, it's exactly this fact that he's showing rather than justifying. There's a difference, in other words, that I draw out in the conclusion between sources and justifications. And the book is largely an attempt to provide a charitable reconstruction of Adorno. But I actually get worried about Adorno's argument and step back from it a little bit at the end, because I think that phenomenological models need to convince you somehow that the description is accurate. Now, they can misfire. The description can be inaccurate. So in that sense, you haven't gotten away from the question of how do you convince someone that your description of the experience is the right one? How do I convince you that Mahler's Third is a great piece of music? Or how do I convince Teddy, by the way, who didn't like Mahler's Second, that Mahler's Second is actually a great piece of music? He disliked the Second Symphony. So it turns out that we can still have very strong disagreements, even if we are just showing, in Adorno's sense, even if we are just offering instances of normativity that somehow reveal themselves in our experience. It turns out we can still disagree. And then the question becomes, I think, Thomas, you just raised it, by what criteria do we begin to have an argument? Or is it simply the case that Adorno is claiming, as if by interpretive authority or fiat, that his interpretation, that his phenomenological model is the right one, that it's somehow incorrigible, that if we somehow have that experience, we'll have exactly his responses? And that's where I think that Adorno may come up short. That's where I think that maybe just providing experiential warrants may not suffice. And we may need some further work in order to say that these pictures I'm giving you of happiness or human flourishing are actually pointing in the right direction. And I don't know that Adorno
But
likes the language of
how would you
justification.
imagine that? So would that mean, on your view, that we would need a more circumscribed notion of human flourishing? So, like an Aristotelian picture of what a virtuous life would be, or are you? So, what kind of what kind of description are you looking for to underwrite these experiential phenomenological models?
I don't know really. I'm just expressing a worry, and this is in a way my core worry about Adorno. It's the worry as to whether his interpretations really suffice to do the kind of normative work that he seems to think they do. And Rahel, this was in a way your opening question. Did I really answer the normativity question? And in a way, the entire book promises something and then fails at the end. But because I say, well, that look, there's a difference between sources and justifications. And with sources, I can point, but I can't tell you that what I'm describing is something that I'm describing accurately. I have to count on you to have the same experience that I'm having for Adorno's argument to go through. And that's where I'm actually a little worried. What I would say in his favor is that he's very fallibilistic about it. Although he says we need to hold fast to the normative, he says we also need to hold fast to our fallibilism and to the possibility that the critique can misfire. And I think that's very interesting. That means that these sources of normativity are indeed, as I would say, damaged by the damaged world in which they appear. And we can never be entirely certain that the interpretations are accurate. And I think Adorno is left in that position. This is why I thought precarious happiness is such a good term for describing the position that he endorses. He wants to say these phenomenological models never carry the warrant of certitude on their foreheads. They don't simply announce their own correctness. They are candidates for our consideration, and they may not have certitude. In fact, Adorno seems to think that the era of philosophical foundationalism, where we could secure certain satisfactions, ultimate rational satisfaction for our moral and political stances, is now phobi. Yeah.
I mean, I was just wondering whether the alternative between showing and justifying is a good one. I mean, for Adorno, or for understanding Adorno, because I mean, you seem to suggest he is only showing, meaning that this, in the end, this is some kind of world disclosing critique. And this actually very often is not a critique, it's something that, yeah, I mean, he shows it and you agree or you disagree, and what are the standards then, as you said. But isn't there an explanatory moment in what he shows and the way he shows, even if it's rich? I mean, phenomenologically speaking, rich, even if he needs those microanalysis in order to make things visible. But isn't there a strong explanatory moment still that, um, which is not the same as a normative justification and not the same as like ultimate foundations for those normative claims, but it is more than just showing, I would say.
I think that's a very nice point. Maybe it is more than just showing. Explaining might be a helpful middle ground. It's they're candidates for our own consideration. That's surely right. And at least in his aesthetic theory, he thinks he has formalist analysis, which can back up his claims. In the book, I speak a little bit about Beethoven's Cavatina from one of the late string quartets, which, by the way, was one of the pieces launched into space on the golden record. So it turns out a lot of humanity agrees with Adorno about this. It's a lovely piece of music. And Adorno speaks specifically about the slow movement and the movement marked beklemmt. And so he thinks you will just hear it the way he hears it. Um, uh, there is that kind of formalist analysis does some, I guess, explanatory work. But one could respond to the late quartets the way Stravinsky did. Stravinsky didn't like them at all. Of course, Adorno got back at him, and he didn't like Stravinsky. So I right.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that brings us also back. We can return to it just for a minute to that question of negativity. I think so. The way you were describing in the beginning, you were making the point that there is a certain kind of methodological negativity that comes in with the dialectical analysis, and the kind of experience that he's describing maybe gets its traction from the dialectical analysis, so from the analysis of these contradictions. So it's more than just, so if you say, well, it's not quite showing, he just doesn't just say, look, it's how beautiful it is, or see, right? But rather he gives you this type of formal analysis where he uncovers a contradiction, a certain kind of dynamics that then show, I mean, kind of, yeah, do more than just claim that something is of a certain sort, but rather show you a certain kind of normative structure that is part of that, right? If it's this kind of negative, so there could be a good form of negative analysis here that does some normative work. I think that this would kind of fit.
If I could take up this question about negativity, Rahel, which you posed at the beginning, I'll offer just a few thoughts on it. I think, well, first of all, we need to distinguish between negativism and negativity. And this is a rather simple distinction. I mean, there's thoroughgoing negativism where the world appears to us as totally false. Okay, that's clearly different from a Hegelian idea of the negativity or tarrying with the negative, which, if done properly, yields something beyond skepticism and results in a kind of learning process and a more expansive conception, say, of experience or of reason, a more expansive Geist, you could say. So that conception of, let's call it negativity, can point to contradictions in the world, and I would say that that still allows us to think of Adorno's methodology as one of negative, a critique, and with an emphasis on the negative. However, I do want to say something about that, which is I fear that might be inadequate um, for what may seem a kind of simple-minded logical reason. We need we need some assurance that that the negative is still pointing in the proper direction, that is, that it has the proper kind of anticipatory character. Because after all, there's abstract negation. Uh, there's pressing on a certain kind of negativity, which doesn't yield anything transformative, better, a more satisfactory, more adequate conception, say, of experience or truth or spirit. It doesn't anticipate at all. It's simply it's let's call it a kind of inert negativity. What justification, what warrant do we have for thinking that the negativity will be properly transformative or will have the properly anticipatory character? I think that that presupposition requires the postulate of a rational whole or a reconciled life. And that's what I think this concept of human flourishing furnishes Adorno in his work, which is to say, through all of the distortions of human life, the image of a unverstellte Menschheit, the image of an undistorted humanity, serves as the postulate which um, gives us the um, which provides us with the warrant or confidence we need that tearing with the negative points us in the proper direction. And that means that there's, if you like, a postulate of the good, which is backing up our conception of a productive negativity, or let's just call it determinate negation. Does that make any sense?
It does. I think it has. There are 2 points. I mean, one is about this image of undistorted or of humanity in an emphatic sense and so on. I think you're totally right, and it's also, but it's also not something that would go against, for example, the anti-utopianism. I would still say one can hold on to the critique of utopianism and still going for this kind of, it's a vague image. I mean, it's something that is not, I mean, the problem with a certain kind of utopianism and a certain kind of positivity here would always be this kind of, I mean, the drawing table kind of, so this is how the world then would look like and should look like. And I think Adorno here, as already Marx, has epistemic as well as practical concerns about this. I mean, epistemic because how can we even imagine a world without still being like without it being distorted by the kind of coercion, tension, the bad that we are into, but also practical reasons. So, but I do think that there is nothing wrong with having this kind of uh, let's say an image that is not, that doesn't claim to be, that is not concrete in a certain sense. But the other thing is about the negativism and the, I mean, my question then for you would be, if you think that one needs these moments of precarious happiness in order to give um, the dynamics of determinate negation, if we're talking about, I mean, a dialectical version of determinate negation here, not just I'm starting from the negative. Why would you then still say that what he does is immanent critique? Or is it then still immanent critique? If you think that the direction is something that, I mean, needs to come from some transcendent standpoint.
Well,
I'm not so sure.
I don't think it comes from a transcendent standpoint. You have intimations of what the world would be like that are already at hand in the world itself. And they're only intimations, and they're damaged, they're precarious. But they are hints of what the world would be like. And this permits him to retain a kind of anti-utopianism, a kind of fallibilism. But he does need at least some epistemic warrant. Otherwise, he would just have to say, well, I have no idea whether this particular critique points in the right direction. This kind of critique could point toward a worse world, right? So there's some weak epistemic warrant that seems to be at work. And this is what I want to call, uh, the damaged norms of a damaged world. We can think these, but through a glass darkly, to use a theological metaphor.
I mean, sometimes he just seems to point to a potential that is very robust, that is not even precarious. I mean, for example, I mean, when he repeatedly says no one should go hungry, no one has to go hungry, but we still do. I mean, this is some kind of a robust standard that he draws from the discrepancy and contradiction between what humankind could have, has reached, and the way it turns out. And that seems to be less precarious, a bit more robust, but still something that is in the world as a potential,
Yeah.
as what could be possible, but not in this very, not actually in the same vague and at the same time transcendent way.
But let me come at it from the other side and make the case of for precariousness. So I wanted to ask you, I mean, so the way you were portraying it now, so it's precarious because we only see it dimly. It's within the context of the negative experience or the negative state of affairs that we have. And so, but the vision of this unverstellte Menschheit would then be one that is somehow rid of the contradictions or free of the contradictions. That you also have this really, for me, fascinating, I found it shocking passage by Adorno where he says, well, the contradictions should go away. They should be absent in that sense. I couldn't believe it. And now why couldn't I believe it? So and my sense is that the way in which Adorno describes experiences of happiness, he wants to be very subtle about it. So some kind of overconfidence of being happy, or some happiness in the face of others, or something like that. That would be the opposite of what he wants. And it seems to me that for that's how I read him. That in a certain sense, true happiness needs to be precarious. There's a certain delicate balance to it in a certain sense. Even we could say that what's false about our society in many respects is it involves all these contradictions, but denies them and covers them and obfuscates them and covers them over and doesn't let them. There's no way for us to acknowledge them. And it seems to me that there's a certain kind of there are certain existential contradictions, let's say, that will never go away, but that constitute human life. And a state of happiness would be one in which we can be open to them, or in which they come to the right, in which they flourish, let's say, in a certain sense. And so I just wanted to ask you whether you see anything of that sort in Adorno, where there's even a positive connotation to precariousness in the realm of happiness.
This is a wonderful question. These are all wonderful questions. What strikes me as a possible difficulty for what you're proposing is Adorno's strange reading of Kant's postulate of immortality, where it looks as if Adorno doesn't want to be satisfied with any of the usual constitutive features of human life, even the fact that we die. He seems to think that we should find this an offense. And partly this is, of course, in the conclusion of the book, where it's a scandal, and it's partly this is in response to Heidegger, who he thinks is trying to squeeze meaning out of our Sein zum Tode, right? And that this is This is Heidegger's hygienic attempt to turn death into an existential category. And Adorno doesn't want to accept that. So he wants to say, God forbid you take the precarity of happiness or any features of our finitude and turn them into philosophemes. Instead, retain that infinite demand, which is articulated by Kant in the postulates of practical reason. Retain that because it imposes a maximal demand for the transformation of our reality, a maximal demand which is so deep that it won't permit of any suffering. And so I like the idea that maybe precarity is somehow constitutive of our happiness, but there's this odd quality to Adorno, which I think helps to explain why his critique of everything is so thoroughgoing, so ruthless. Right? His critique is ruthless because the transformation that he's imagining is nearly impossible. And that's why it has to be a kind of counterfactual postulate in the Kantian sense.
But isn't it still true? Because I I found Thomas' idea here very convincing. Isn't it still true that he has, let's say, an utterly negative relation to robust happiness? I mean, you might be right about the infinite demand. Huh?
Der Natur,
Yeah,
the happiness of the Natur.
der Pausbäckige, there are all these remarks about like the Pausbäckige, what is it, cheek, Pausbäckig?
Oh, that's it.
I don't know. Pausbäckiger Sozialdemokrat.
Yeah.
You immediately know. I mean, and I, you know what I mean? And I also think that one of the reasons for a certain tension between Marcuse and Adorno was that Marcuse was so much more about like robust happiness. Whereas there is this kind of, but you are still right that, I mean, the idea in the end is infinite demand, not some kind of life is always tragic and we will just have to, have to deal with those tragical, events and tensions in a better way. You're right on this, but at the same time, how to make sense of the critique of robust happiness.
Absolutely. And there's the odd passage in Minima Moralia where he contrasts the two images of Freud, and he's very concerned about the idea of maximizing human potential, which is a capitalist way of mining all of the features of human life such that their utility is somehow maximized. And he opposes that idea of fulfillment to his own idea of happiness, which he says is rien faire comme une bête, right? So there's some strange contrast here where he wants, I would say it's flourishing without fulfillment, or it's somehow happiness without maximalization. And so I grant that he has that. What's very interesting is that at the same time, he wants to uphold this notion of perfect happiness, even if it loses all of its dynamism, it becomes a kind of image of animal-like stasis. He calls that Freud's critical standard, kritischer Maßstab, right? And so once again, it looks like there's something that has a function of a postulate, which is some idea of how we would be truly happy, which is providing him the critical leverage he needs, even against some idea of maximizing human potential. Admittedly, this is a very paradoxical thing, and I'm not saying I want to endorse it all the way. I'm saying that this seems to be the logic that's at work in the way he thinks of the necessary critical standards that guide the practice of criticism.
Great. So I think at this point, I would definitely want to give you the chance in the audience also to raise questions, make comments. I think we have a microphone there on the right. So are there any comments, questions over here on the left-hand side and in the middle? I would suggest we take 2 or 3 comments now, and then we start on the left-hand side over there. And then to David Jacobs and then in the first row. Let's hear these three comments and then.
Okay. Professor, thanks for your talk and your excellent book. Although your writing is much more fluent and logical than Adorno himself, the kernel argument remains still a little bit uncompelling to me. I have a little short come up to your discussion and a detailed questions. It seemed to me that you approach to reconstruction Adorno as a source of normativity is more like mountain come to Muhammad, not the other way around. What I mean is that instead of saying that Adorno has other dimension than the social criticism, basically you're arguing that his social criticism is a source of normativity. So a little bit like for the case of Adorno, you lose the a little bit standards of norm. And I would say that exactly the Adorno's way when he's answering the tension between the practice and the theory. He said that the theorizing is also a practice, and that's not eager to what he saw as the false or fake practice. I would say in that case, there's no such thing as total negativism, since everyone is theorizing their what will, unless he's unconscious. So that's my first follow-up. I think that your concept of normativity is a little bit broader than what we usually think. And I have detailed questions. In the late chapter of your book, you have a little comparison between the Foucault and Adorno. You claim that Adorno break the symbiosis between subject and dominations, while Foucault did not. I just wondering that could be another point. Maybe you could develop into your next monograph, since since it's a little bit against my instinct in the academia. Seems to me that in the last decade, even the mainstream of the critical theory in German needs Foucault more than, let's say, the American sociologists or the French sociologists need Adorno. So how could you say that Adorno is more instructive than Foucault in social studies? Thank you. That's my question.
David Jacobs. Yeah, David Jacobs.
Hello. I was wondering if there's anything in Adorno suggesting that he thinks that those like traces of normativity, this like precarious happiness, might be extinguished one day completely, or like that this could completely vanish. And I'm asking this because if he seems to suggest that this is not really a possibility, like something like that, some experience like that will be available, one might suggest that it is not indeed an immanent critique, but that this critique is indeed based on an assumption of something like a human nature and philosophical anthropology, or like maybe some metaphysical assumptions. However, if there is anything in Adorno suggesting that like this experience might be completely gone one day, then it might be that he wants to say, well, it is indeed our society we're living in, like a bourgeois capitalist society that still allows for some experience of precarious happiness. And hence, and then it would be indeed the immanent critique, since it is the society we're living in that allows for that experience, that allows to criticize the society we're living in, even in a fashion that directs radically beyond it.
Thank you. In the first row.
Hi, Alex Lin from Berkeley here. Thank you to all three professors for your wonderful conversation. I have two questions which perversely will bracket out normativity for the time being. The first one for Professor Gordon is a sort of methodological question about, in the most general terms, how was reading Adorno or reading for these examples for this book as opposed to for Migrants in the Profane? And the interest behind this question is tying together several things that you've mentioned from the beginning to the end of your presentation. You began with moments of resistance, which are precarious, which are hard to find, which as was your way of describing partial negativism. So we have these moments of resistance that we find in the world. Then you also have examples. In this case, you talked about examples in Adorno's works, examples, instances that, for example, uh, exemplify his reading of Kant's postulate of immortality. So moments, we have examples and instances, and then at the end, you problematize this, talking about Adorno's own use of examples as sources, things that he's showing, things that come with claims and interpretations, but don't have this uh, experiential warrant to them necessarily. So it's partly this question about just the practice of reading or rereading Adorno, but also to put a spin on Professor Jaeggi's question, what if you found what if there were no examples of happiness in Adorno, just as you could say there are no examples of happiness in the world, could we still find some potentiality for immanent critique? And much more briefly, the second question is perhaps a provocation, that's the talk about the precarity or the subtlety, as Professor Khurana put it, of these sources or of the idea of happiness immediately reminds me of something else in Kant, not in the critique of practical reason, but the critique of judgment, namely aesthetic judgments, which are precisely not things empirically grounded, but have this claim on universal recognition, but through non-conceptual grounds. So those are the two questions, and thank you once again.
Thank you. Wonderful questions. So I think,
Whoosh.
Peter, you can now pick and choose, I think.
It's a lot of questions. All right. But I'll try to take up a few themes here. First, so the bit on Foucault at the end is probably the grumpiest portion of the book. And I think that people who are more sympathetic to Foucault than I am will quite rightly feel that that I'm perhaps being uncharitable. I want to insist on the fact that one very strong difference between Foucault and Adorno needs to be kept in mind, which is that Foucault does think that we're constituted through power. And the strong distinction between subject and object doesn't feature in his work the way it does for Adorno. Adorno requires and sustains the relation between subject and object, but also sustains their differentiation so that he can imagine that there's a proper way for the human being to experience itself in its openness and its vulnerability to the object. But we're not thoroughly constituted by power. And this permits Adorno to think of the human being as having a moment, psychic life, an experiential life that is prior to the moment of its discovery. I think that the reading of psychoanalysis in Foucault actually disallows that thought. Foucault sees psychoanalysis as a strategy not for uncovering the unconscious, but for constituting it, not for uncovering desire, but for constituting desire. Psychoanalysis, in other words, is a strategy which, as Foucault says, implants in the self the reality it claims only to disclose. I think Adorno, on the contrary, thinks of the human being as having real psychic depth and real suffering and a real potential for happiness. And to me, this is a very important distinction. And I guess I would call the moment of constructivism in Foucault in this respect just leaves me unmoved. I don't understand what it would be like for us to actually experience ourselves that way. It's an interesting, let's say, it's an interesting counterfactual way of entertaining social theory, but I don't think it's one we actually live. So there's much more I could say on this, and it's all said in broad brushstrokes at the end of the book. And I am trying, for this reason, to prize apart Adorno and Foucault when I realize that there's a trend recently to try to assimilate them or bring them closer together. And I'm trying to insist on the difference And ultimately, the difference is that I think that Adorno at least wants to hold open some conception of the sources of normativity that doesn't collapse the distinction between normativity and power. And I think for Foucault, who never wanted to be a comprehensive moral theorist in this sense, is willing to entertain that collapse. Now, again, in Foucault's defense, he doesn't claim to be a foundational social theorist or comprehensive social theorist. When you press him with these kinds of questions, he changes his experimental mood and he changes his social descriptions because he's always offering us, if you like, experiments. And in that sense, he's a very different kind of thinker. I don't think he wants to be a comprehensive social theorist. In that sense, he doesn't need to respond to the challenge of self-reflexivity. And in this respect, I would say that, maybe Habermas's criticism was misplaced. Anyways, that's enough about Foucault. As regards human nature, or whether Adorno has a philosophical anthropology, I say somewhere in the book that I think he comes very close to having a philosophical anthropology. And I think we can see this if we look at Dialectic of Enlightenment, that along with Horkheimer, Adorno has a conception of just what it's like to be a human being that involves mimetic capacities that really do need to find expression. If they don't, and if the withering of experience continues, there would be an endpoint at which we would really no longer qualify as candidates for the description of human. And I think that's Adorno's nightmare scenario. Now, I think it's crucial for the practice of his critique that he believes we haven't yet reached that point. He speaks of the dying out. What's the word in German? Is it Absterben? The withering out of experience, the dying out of experience. But he doesn't say experience has vanished entirely. And there's a crucial difference there. Sometimes Adorno exaggerates. Sometimes Adorno says experience is no longer possible, or there's no longer a self. The self has just become a bundle of human impressions, right? Sometimes he speaks that way. But other times he pulls back from the exaggeration and he says that what he's describing is the dystopian possibility that he wants to warn us against in our criticism. But this means I think he does have to hold on to some conception of what it's like to be a human being. This is the emphatische, the emphatic concept of humanity that I think guides him in his work. I don't know if we want to call it something as rich as a philosophical anthropology, but he does seem to think that it's a sufficiently constant feature of the human being, that it's characterized the human being from the very beginning, from the moment we descended from the trees and began to both respond to nature and dominate nature, which is to say, mimesis and the withering of mimesis have characterized all of human history. So that's a very strong claim. The final question. I mean, I'm delighted to hear that someone's read not only one book but two of my books. What if there were no examples? Let me end with this point. What if instead of instances of precarious happiness or moments, traces of normativity, what if there were no examples at all? I think I can refer back to the second question. I think at that moment we could no longer say that we qualify as human. I think that would have to be Adorno's picture. And I think that's a nightmare scenario he is deeply concerned about, that animates all of his, to use the Marxian phrase, ruthless criticism of everything existing. So, thanks.
Okay, thank you. So I unfortunately we are running out of time. So I can only say, so if I hadn't read the book, now I would want to after that conversation. And so I think that's the best we can do, I think, for tonight. So I'm sorry we couldn't discuss more questions, but we can't do everything. So one question that we didn't really come to is what all of this means for the future of critical theory. maybe there's some other context in which this might come up again, namely the Benjamin lectures by Lea Ypi, which will happen in the Haus der Kulturen der Welt on June 19 to June 19, June 20, and June 21. And Peter won't be there, but Rael and myself will be there. So I hope to see you there again. And thanks so much for coming out tonight. And let's thank Rahel Jaeggi and Peter Gordon for that wonderful conversation.